The good news is that we have a fantastic panel lined up to talk about a topic that is really important to the Sri Lankan private sector, particularly with the kind of paradigm shifts we are seeing in international trade and globalization around the world, as well as because there are so many policy reforms and policy initiatives happening in Sri Lanka right now on trade. 3 FTAs in the pipeline. In the newspaper, we see more FTAs being talked about. All of these have consequences and opportunities for business. So hopefully we'll try to dissect some of those. Before I sit down and ask our speakers to take it from there, I just want to remind you of the few housekeeping announcements. I won't be reading out their profiles in full. They're in your faculty book, but I'll briefly introduce them as they speak. We have, as in the previous sessions, we have slips of paper for you to pose your questions, and my colleagues are available at any time during the session for you to hand it to them, and they'll bring it up over here, as well as the app. So pose your questions through the app as well. We will have 2 speakers, first Ganeshan and then Harsha, who will be delivering their remarks from the podium, and then we'll go into an interaction among the panelists, and then, of course, take your questions as well. So, first up, we have, and I must say this is a very interesting panel because we have international trade negotiators, academics, Sri Lankan trade experts. We have folks who've seen trade work in Asia, and also from the private sector viewpoint, as well as on the trade facilitation side. So we have with us Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, the chair of the Global Economy Program at the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies. He's just back in the country after finishing off a tenure at the Asian Development Bank in the Chief Economist Office. We have Dr. Harshavardhan Singh, the Executive Director of Brookings Institution, India. We have Dr. Dushni Virakon from our very own Institute of Policy Studies. We have Elizabeth Ward, the Special Negotiator at the Office of Trade Negotiations at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. And our new addition to the panel, which it may not be in your faculty books because those went to print a little while back, is Eric Miller. And we're really pleased to have Eric Miller with us. He's the president and founder of Radio Potomac Strategy Group. But more importantly to Sri Lanka, he's part of the Global Alliance on Trade Facilitation, which will be launching a project here in Sri Lanka to improve our trade facilitation, something, again, that matters to a lot of us. You heard about customs, single window, etc. That's coming as well. So let's kick things off. Ganesh, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce Economic Summit. 3 recent developments motivate this presentation. First of all, we have a national government in Sri Lanka that's talking about an investment-led export strategy. Second, we have an Asian and global economy and the trade sector that's recovering from a global financial crisis rather tepidly. And third, we have protectionism exemplified by the US administration and America first. So then what is Sri Lanka's story? Where might we be in terms of our trade performance and investment performance, and where might we go? So I'm going to try to present kind of 9 sets of stylized facts for your thinking and to sort of set the stage for this session. The first kind of fact really relates to the shift in the nature of trade and growth in the last 4 or 5 years, and what might be the prognosis for the next 2 to 3 years. And what we have here is, in blue, trade growth, and in red, we have GDP growth, okay? And we have the period just before the global financial crisis, 2003 to 6, and the period after, and a forecast, and we have developing Asia, China, and Sri Lanka. The basic takeaway from this slide is that trade growth exceeded GDP growth, and the ratio was something like 2 in the heyday of globalization in Asia. That number comes down dramatically after the financial crisis, driven by a fall in the trade growth of China from some 18% per year, some very dizzy number, to about 4%. And when you get to Sri Lanka, you see a slightly different pattern. In 2003 to 6, that ratio was 0.8. So trade growth was not as fast as GDP growth in the pre-global financial crisis period. 2003 to 2016, you see that number reaching 2.3, and then the forecast is 1.3 in 2017 to 2019. And that is the issue that is of concern. The nice thing is that our trade growth has been fairly fast in the recent period. And this is the real growth of goods and services exports, and this is IMF data. So the forecasts are that of the IMF economists, not myself. Okay? So this is, insofar as people think that the IMF is the best economics organization globally, this is what they think will be the case in a country like Sri Lanka. Yeah? The second stylized fact, and this is where the challenges come in. So while our trade growth hasn't been so bad and we are counter-cyclical compared to the rest of Asia, what we export is challenging. And one part of it is that our export base is low and concentrated, and there has been a shift in the recent period, but it's basically tea and textiles. Services are the new factor, but we haven't really got into the global supply chain, which is a really important aspect of what we could do and what drove East Asia's success. And we have got into the IT sector, but only $900 million worth of IT exports, according to the EDB, possibly some 80,000 jobs, they say. So there are gaps in our export basket, and the overall volume is only $17 billion. So it's very small when you think of the hundreds of millions of dollars exported by Malaysia, for instance. Third stylized fact, our markets remain very much what they were at the time of liberalization in 1977. 50% of our exports goes to the EU and the US, and that hasn't changed very much. And what is missing in this is really Asia, and by that only 2% goes to China, very small, given the influence of China, we think, on the investment side and the projects that people were talking about. And India, which is only 6%. And typically countries trade with their geography. So you trade with your nearest neighbor a lot. Not happening in the case of Sri Lanka. And then Japan, the ASEAN countries, etc., only 9%. So we are not really trading with probably the most dynamic region in the world, which is Asia. And that is potentially challenging for us. People have talked about foreign investment, and this graph shows you the actual values of FDI flows for Sri Lanka, and it shows you what other people are getting in relation to gross domestic investment. And what you see is a checkered pattern. Our investment is less than $1 billion as of last year, FDI inflows, and in relation to our gross fixed capital formation, it's under 5%. You see the comparators. FDI plays a much greater role in the rest of the region than in ours, and it's vital for bringing technology transfer, marketing connections, and skills, which are fundamental if we want to change the structure of our economy, as the Prime Minister says, from a sort of a low-tech, commodity-dependent country to something more high-tech, medium-tech, with higher skills. Now, the things I said at the beginning with Donald Trump, a slowdown in trade, naturally have fueled export pessimism in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. How can we go forward when the rest of the region and the global market is in a difficult position? However, one should not be overly pessimistic. The first is that the US is still useful in our export basket in terms of a source of demand, and the US is expected to grow at 2.5% this year. So that important fact means there'll be demand for our exports, and so that's a key driver. The other, which is more useful, is China's rebalancing. China is going from an export-led industrial model to domestic demand and services, and this will create a whole lot of opportunities for a country like Sri Lanka, and something that we should exploit given the Chinese presence in this economy in terms of infrastructure and tourism. There are at least 4 examples of things that might occur. The first is the easy bit. Some of the things China did in terms of labor-intensive exports, ranging from textiles and garments right through to electronics and eventually auto parts, can well be done here through global value chains. Much of that is now in India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. We can attract some of that. A second area is as China moves up the value-added chain to more sophisticated industries, there'll be another value chain and an industrial process which we might tap into, for instance, in the IT sector. Yeah? A third area is much of our exports come from large firms. Small and medium enterprise is not really present in our trading, and there are big opportunities for them both in manufacturing as well as the service sector, and another thing we should exploit. So there are these opportunities if we're able to access them properly. Now, what do we make of our trade strategy? And one of Anushka's points was that we should talk about smart trade strategy. And when you read the newspapers, you feel that everything is bad here in terms of trade and trade strategy. It's not quite true. We have some useful achievements in terms of trade agreements and in terms of getting market access. For instance, Sri Lanka did sign the WTO's trade facilitation agreement, and that came into effect in February this year. And with the electronic customs, I think Sri Lanka Pay it's called, that will help reduce trade costs in the time to come, right? So something very useful and very practical that government has done. A second thing that government has done is reinstate the GSP Plus, which gives us preferential access to the European Union market, right, for some products, but it's time-bound, right? It's time-bound till probably 2024, if I get that right. So we have a window of 8 years in which to take advantage of this thing, right, and then get on non-preferential terms, which is most likely what will happen. No amount of special pleading is going to get GSP Plus renewed, perhaps, if we hit that income threshold. FTAs are an emerging area, and probably the thrust is right to have FTAs with India, a more enhanced one, China, the obvious player, and Singapore, which has multiple FTAs across Asia and is very promiscuous in terms of who they trade with. Probably the thrust is right, okay? However, this will take time, okay? FTA negotiations typically take 3-4 years, perhaps. So a start has been made, but they take time because of the complexity of the negotiations and the fact that we have very limited trade negotiations capacity. From what I understand of it, it's usually has been done by one person trying to coordinate with different ministries. The technical work is done by the Department of Commerce. It's a very limited structure compared to what you have in other countries, and we may want to come back in the chat to that issue. So it'll take time by definition. However, for China, I think they will want to give us an FTA for political reasons, and we should be smart, and this is the first smart point, Anishka, to exploit that opportunity and the goodwill that they want to give us. And that's okay. Let's get China first. That will hopefully create competition for India to want to give us a deep FTA. And Singapore is doable, but will have some interesting challenges. The future agenda in the FTA architecture, which I think is something we could pursue, is something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And this is the counterpart to the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States. And it involves the ASEAN countries, China, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and it covers 30% of world GDP. So if we gain access to that in some way, that would be a big gain, both in terms of income gains, as well as the fact that RCEP is low ambition and is very development friendly. There are easier adjustment terms for the developing countries there. It's lower ambition in terms of goods, services, and perhaps some investment. So there are many reasons we may want to consider RCEP, and Singapore is probably our route to RCEP, and that's something we may want to exploit, particularly in our bilateral relationship. Now, the first baby steps for us is observer status in ASEAN. And I learned something recently that Sri Lanka had been offered ASEAN membership way back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we said no. Very bright spark, right? Now it will be hard for us to get this in terms of observer status, and we may have to pursue this along sectoral lines, and it, again, something we may come to in the chat. But we should emphasize this thrust in our commercial diplomacy, which Foreign Minister Karunanaka has talked about, getting ASEAN membership, and we should beef up our embassy in Indonesia with an explicit mandate to try to seek some ways of having a dialogue with ASEAN. A second aspect of this is really building up our trade negotiations capacity. Trying to do multiple FTAs with a very limited team and getting into RCEP is going to be extremely challenging. and something we really have to create a really good capacity if we want to do this, with economists as well as lawyers and experienced negotiators. Here is a very simple story about FTA-led regionalism across Asia, and Sri Lanka has very few agreements in effect, and look at the others. Singapore, very promiscuous, 20-odd agreements with virtually every partner in the world, but the real rock star is Korea, has an agreement with the US and with the European Union. And they're very deep agreements, and they have a very sophisticated system of FTA support. They have FTA courses in 15 universities. They have set up a new institution to provide technical assistance to SMEs to make use of FTAs, and so on. I can go on about Korea as a separate lecture if I ever get invited back here, but that's the model we want to think about. But Sri Lanka is a laggard in this game and a new entrant, and something we've got to think about. Now, the seventh issue we've got to think about is really about deepening reforms, and they talked about this a lot, and I kind of did a very quick balance sheet for myself against some other East Asian countries and thinking about where we are on different indicators. We have achieved some things, and there are areas we need to improve. In terms of tariffs, we haven't done so badly. 9.3%, down quite a bit over the years. Agriculture is still heavily protected, some 20-odd% in terms of agricultural protection, but industrial goods, some peaks and so on. We've got to deal with para-tariffs. That number could come down to 7, probably fairly short space of time. Ease of doing business, a big problem. Government has made a major effort on this, 8 committees, etc., e-customs. But enforcement of contracts, the legal system is up the spout in this country, and something they've got to do about if we want to get FDI in here. You cannot solve business disputes easily here, let alone any other kind of dispute. We've got to deal with the registration of property and so on. Paying taxes, they're trying to do something about. Then there is the tech bit, which we're badly on. We have fewer researchers in R&D than other countries. We don't have very good internet statistics. There is a problem, and I know the internet is being discussed in another panel, and we don't finance our SMEs properly. Interest rates are 18%, 19, 20%. Access to credit is challenging. There are problems both on the banking system as well as on the side of the SMEs. We have to look at our collateral laws. A lot of areas we have to do. So deepening structural reforms is absolutely necessary, just as fiscal issues are there. So in summary, I think Sri Lanka has made achievements over the years in terms of trade, and trade growth isn't too bad, but there are some problems in terms of the export basket, the fact that FDI lags trade, and the fact that we are not trading as much with the most dynamic markets in the world. Going to be much harder for Sri Lanka going forward than in the past, but I'm not unduly pessimistic with the opportunities in value chains, services, and SMEs, and FTAs with East Asia, the bilaterals, but as well as RCEP down the track, and ASEAN membership through observer status, and implementing reforms and infrastructure are critical. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the organizers for the invitation, this opportunity, and the hospitality, and wonderful to be with you to interact and share some thoughts. I want to address a few questions which were raised when the program was discussed with me, and also some finer points, because the discussion since the morning shows that the policymakers know a lot of the areas which need to be addressed. And in general, whether it's a policy document or it is the planning and linking with experts globally, the right kind of steps are being taken. Therefore, I will try and point out a little bit along the lines of priorities which the McKinsey partner had talked about in terms of actually implementing these steps rather than just thinking about them in a large way. So there's the large and the small, and that's one of the issues I'll address. But before that, some of the queries which were raised to me: where do you see global trade headed, given the trends over the last year and a half with trade at its lowest level? We saw Ganeshan's first slides showing that. It's good to say that right now we see a resurgence of trade again. WTO expects trade growth in 2017 to be 2.4%, up from 1.3% last year, and slight increase next year. The reason is that the GDP has started picking up. Historically, whenever economic and financial collapse happen at the same time, it takes about 7 years or so for recovery to take place. We are now in our 8th year. So from past experience, a turnaround ought to be expected. And the figures are, the IMF forecasts 3.5% this year and 3.6% next year. There's a slight decrease it has made recently in the growth of US and UK. But the interesting thing is, US, which was seen as the locomotive of the global economy in terms of growth, its slight decrease has no impact on the IMF overall growth estimates of the world. That shows the dynamism of Asia. China, 6.25 to 6.5, India, 7 3/4 next year. Both China and India, these figures are next year's, and good growth expected in Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and other countries in Asia. So the momentum is going to continue. Once that continues, trade will also keep picking up. So the scenario is turning. It appears to be turning. On the protectionism, yes, it's true that the view in general is to look inwards, especially in larger economies, US being primary in that. However, the interesting feature is, while they are looking inwards towards their own domestic market and job creation, they are also seeking markets outside. So it's a combination of looking inwards for domestic, providing access to your domestic market, but seeking larger markets abroad, which means that many of the concepts which were in vogue before this regime changed are still being emphasized. So in the negotiation on NAFTA, for instance, the starting point is the TPP. So it'll be, this change will be more of the same sort of thing, and then a little bit from looking at what else might happen in rules of origin, etc. But fundamentally, the framework of the regulatory processes will remain similar. Interestingly, WTO has just announced that from mid-October 2016 to mid-May 2017, the world has seen the lowest increase in monthly average for new trade measures being put in place. Ever since 2008, 2009, new trade measures were being put in place, even though the world said we will stop, halt protectionism. The smallest number has been in the last 7 or 8 months. So that's another good development in terms of, though looking inwards, but the trade measures per se are slowing down. Another question raised to me was, what do I see as India's trade strategy, and what does it mean for its neighbors like Sri Lanka through ETCA, etc.? So India is both looking inwards and outwards. The interesting thing is that it's looking, trade policy today is not just at the border, it's inside the border. That's where it overlaps with domestic policy. So trade facilitation is not only for customs, although the trade facilitation agreement relates to customs issues, trade facilitation is far deeper, affects the efficiency of operation far deeper into the economy. So India is looking very strongly at the internal processes and reforming them. At the border, interestingly, it's looking at those tariffs and lowering them, which are inputs into its Make in India program. In fact, if you see the budget for the last 2 years or so, there is a section on Make in India inputs. I mean, these are Make in India tariffs, which are lowered. So it's a combination, but they continue to see, because of the internal focus and the global markets, they continue to see standards as being very important. And if you look at what India is doing, and you see what is the main objective in ECTA, it doesn't seem to be the situation doesn't seem to change in any way in terms of achieving those objectives. They are still viable. There is likely to be momentum towards them, including the early harvest program with respect to mutual recognition of conformity assessment procedures, something which is also emphasized by the national trade policy framework, which the central bank governor was talking about in the morning. Then, looking at Sri Lanka embarking on new trade reform effort through tariff liberalization, preferential trade arrangements, and export promotion, one question I saw in the blurb was, is this a foolhardy strategy? It's not foolhardy, it's just incomplete way of looking at things. When you look at trade policy, you have to look at the entire complex, internal, external. Therefore, when you are looking at implementation of trade policy is today overlapping with domestic policy, and a lot of emphasis has been given to competitiveness. Competitiveness is a focus also of trade policy. But when we look at competitiveness, we are looking inwards in the sense of domestic policy, production processes, cost efficiency. But if you are competing in the world through trade policy, competitiveness has to be not only through cost efficiency, etc., but outside your realm in the international segment. And you don't compete only on costs, you don't compete only on quality, you compete by linking up with people, making them realize the relevance of your product. Therefore, a competitiveness policy which is far more complete in my view will not only be commercial, it will flank it with political relations, it will flank it with connecting with another country to learn, or at least let it take an interest in what you are doing by sharing success cases and helping you implement them here. If Singapore is very efficient in managing its port, in managing some of its infrastructure, can Sri Lanka government talk to Singapore government and request some similar kind of successful implementation in its own country? If not, where else can it do it? Because the whole thing is, how do I actually connect in such a way that people start noticing what I'm doing, and I also start improving my opportunities frontier in that manner. So competitiveness, the concept of competitiveness has to expand in my view, which I don't think is realized till now. Secondly, I was looking, when I was looking on the net for assessment of of Sri Lanka's competitiveness and ease of doing business, etc., other than conventional kind of measures, I didn't see it mentioned in many of the fora where it would be wonderful to be taken note of in those discussions, whether it's OECD, whether it's some other assessments in the World Bank, etc. Therefore, in some sense, the whole functioning is below the radar. That needs to be raised to a much higher level, because Sri Lanka has, whatever the problems, it has a lot of strengths. If you look at the competitiveness index, which the World Economic Forum calculates, within South Asia, Sri Lanka is the best performer for technological readiness, health and primary education, higher education and training, and therefore potentially with efforts and specific policies to prepare itself for the future. That message must be given far more loudly and in the right kind of fora, which I don't think is being done. In a dynamic world, effort will need to be made to link with new products and technologies. But at the same time, there's a lot of big picture, big projects. What really starts working is to also see where is the low-hanging fruit. How many of us, when we are talking about Sri Lanka growing, that exports need to be diverse? Actually, Sri Lanka's exports are quite diversified. It's just that they are very narrowly concentrated. Even if you look at the exports to India, the number of product categories exported to India is more than 50. So when you look at that and you combine it with product space analysis of Ricardo Hausmann, etc., the question is that which is not working. Why should we only look at complexity? How can we enable something which is actually there to grow much larger? The low-hanging fruit has to be a focus. Success has to be there to pave the way. Small steps towards a larger target. The other thing, and Harsha De Silva's answer in terms of certain questions showed the very sound awareness of this, is that with change in technology, the ground is shifting. And when the ground is shifting, you have to anticipate what is the likely situation, say, next 10 years. And what will happen in next 10 years, conventionally, when I was younger, would probably happen in next 50 years. Time is getting compressed because of the rapidity and impact of technological change. And you have to prepare not only your industry, your regulatory processes for that. You have to, and when you are dealing with the new economy of internet, just having regulatory processes appropriate in your own domestic economy is not enough. By definition, internet does not respect the jurisdictional territory of a nation. You can have businesses between people across two territories. You have to connect with the regulators in another country. You have to focus on regulatory coherence. And you have to do it today. Tomorrow, you will delay. So if you have managed to do it tomorrow, even then you'll be in the race. So there is a concept of just, instead of focusing on oneself, you have to try and see which are the efforts which I have to make with others to help myself. Which brings me to another point, which is, we have heard a lot about free trade agreements. Ganesh said free trade agreements take time. Can we think of things which are useful and be done more quickly, meaningfully, which pave the way for the free trade agreement, and can be done in a way that the free trade agreement, when it is reached, is half prepared already? This is something which requires you to take a step back and look at some existing model. Take TPP. I'm not saying Sri Lanka is ready to be a member of TPP. India is not ready to be a member of TPP. But I've just written on how India can actually use TPP for its own domestic reform and regional collaborative initiatives in specific chapters. Regulatory coherence, digital. Why can we not pick out areas which show that this is the way to move towards good governance, an internationally agreed high standard method? Be it technical barriers to trade, be it sanitary, phytosanitary measures, be it e-commerce, be it regulation and good governance provisions. That is a ready-made framework or menu of actions to take. So something which you actually can achieve in smaller steps, meaningfully, and get the trade agreement forward. So the other thing which we have to keep in mind is, if you are getting into a trade agreement, you will have to reduce your tariffs. And you will not always be given a situation where it will be highly preferential to you. The other side will ask you for very uncomfortable kind of decisions. For that, innovative flexibilities need to be made, prepared, offered, and tested. Even in the TPP, the US and Japan, two very highly developed economies, for certain products took 30 years breathing period. And there are many other flexibilities. So it's not only opening up markets, but it's also deciding when you are in trouble, how to get breathing space. These are some of the ideas I want to share with you. More can be done during the question-answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harsha. And I think you've set the stage nicely for our next two speakers. Particularly two pickups for me was this focus. Trade policy is no longer just at the border and beyond the border, but within the border and looking at the domestic policy agenda as well. And hopefully our next three speakers will pick up on that because it's also preparing the domestic, the groundwork, preparing the domestic private sector, as well as this whole trade facilitation agenda. So I'm now going to turn to Elizabeth. We're very fortunate to have a trade negotiator, very experienced trade negotiator with us, and oftentimes this idea of executing a smarter trade strategy falls ultimately onto a country's trade negotiator or negotiators, and this is very important perspective for Sri Lanka. So coming from Australia, that has been quite aggressive and ambitious in some of its trade agreements. We're very lucky to have Elizabeth with us. So over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much, Anushka. We've listened to two fantastically interesting presentations. I'm sure everyone can agree. And for me, as I'm listening to them, I feel like there's two or three questions that are sort of coming together. What's sort of happening in the world of trade? And of course, that's over to you, the audience, as the business community in Sri Lanka. You're getting on with things. There are lots of elaborate supply chains through East Asia, through Southeast Asia. Arguably, I would say less so in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is now looking to manage exactly how to link itself into those sort of supply chains. But we're seeing, as per Ganesh's slide, a slowdown in growth of trade. That productivity growth that we saw going crazy in the pre-GFC era really slowing down now, but steady growth. And you all know that business is working very hard. But today we're looking at both the fact business is getting on with its work, but what is happening on the policy front? And I guess that's where many of us have an interest here on the panel. What does the turbulence in political rhetoric around the world, what does that mean for trade? What does it mean for Sri Lanka? What does it mean for a Sri Lanka which is contemplating some thoroughgoing reforms to its trading policies and profiles? So this is a really fascinating sort of conflation of a whole lot of issues. And for me, as an Australian, coming from the Australian government, an Australian government that takes a very open market approach to trade policy, this is a perfect opportunity for me to step out for you a little bit in my 2 minutes remaining of some of what sits behind Australia's position. Now, my professional life has been, at least in the last few years, working a lot with economies in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, and through a prism of APEC. Now, what I can say is that APEC has been a fantastic mechanism for countries in this region to come together and for regulators to really talk about what makes economies glue together, what provides us with mechanisms to share our, how can we share our experiences and how can we each benefit from that? What we've really learned is from our shared experience and our shared history over the last 2 or 3 decades is that we can best engage in our interconnected world, and turning your back on globalization, frankly, is not an option. We are in an interconnected world. The best way to do this is to build institutions and agreements that are able to shape and manage open interaction between our economies to build certainty for you, the business community, and for finance markets so you can really build a world where we can benefit consumers. And that, at the end of the day, is what open borders is all about. For developing countries, I've been asked to provide some comments on this. Well, excuse me, what I've seen is through APEC's experience that developing countries have benefited enormously from embracing a liberalised market setting. You know, it might be easy to think you're not trade exposed. It might be easy for Australia to say, well, we're actually a very long way away from Mexico. We'll be okay. But the reality is we are not, and Sri Lanka is not. It's not okay to not do anything in this situation because we are all trade exposed. And, you know, the Australian government's Productivity Commission recently in the last week released a very interesting report on the impact of the Australian economy on potentially protectionist policies being put in place. And in fact, one of the outcomes from some modelling that they did was that a 1% downturn in Australia's economy as a result of protectionist measures being put in place would lead to the loss of 100,000 jobs in Australia. So we take this very seriously. It's a risk we need to talk about and manage and mitigate. And the very best way for us to do that is to work towards freer markets, twinned with that to make sure that our domestic policy settings are right, to make sure our economy is as resilient as possible, to make sure our workforce is as adaptable as possible. And thirdly, that we have a very clear narrative domestically about the value of having a liberalised and liberalising set of trade policy priorities. Now, just lastly, 1 minute, if I may, before I hand over to the next speaker. I, for the last 6 years, have been very involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. And it has been a great shame for me to see what has happened to that very significant body of work. A great shame for the United States, which misses out, which has damaged itself geopolitically and misses out commercially from a very significant undertaking. But I would just say to you, and the reason I wanted to mention this is because it does have an impact on Sri Lanka and the way we all think about trade policy. First thing is the TPP is not actually going away. There are now discussions underway for a reconstitution of that group without the United States. That conversation's going on. But perhaps more importantly right now, the two messages that I wanted to leave with you are the TPP, as Harsha said, did deliver some cutting-edge trade policies that really do try and get to some contemporary trade problems. WTO, which we would all prefer would be up and running and working and delivering for us, is not able at the moment in its current situation to deliver these sort of outcomes, but the TPP has provided a blueprint. And those of us who have been involved in the TPP are using these things already and putting them into other agreements. But as Harsha suggests, this is a great opportunity for other countries to look at what has been done in that kind of agreement and to basically plunder it. Please, plagiarism, you're very welcome. Please borrow it and please use it as much as you can. And the third thing I would say is the TPP has been a catalyst for domestic reform. We all know when we do our assessments of these trade policy outcomes that we've negotiated, that those countries, the countries that stand to benefit most from trade agreements are those that put in place the deepest reforms through those agreements. So we've seen, even though the TPP now is sitting there and unlikely to be ratified in its current form at the moment, that a number of the parties who were involved in that negotiation have decided to go ahead with those reforms anyway. And so it's that sort of lesson, the unilateral reform lesson, which is so powerful and really a great learning moment for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think there's an important strand emerging here from everybody's comments on this role of the domestic agenda, domestic policy reform, competitiveness challenges, as well as the regulatory gaps that need to be fixed domestically in order for us to leverage on FTAs. And I feel to some extent this hasn't been given enough attention here in Sri Lanka, because maybe for so many years we hadn't done FTAs, and now the aggressive nature with which we're pursuing the FTAs, that conversation is going faster than some of the domestic reforms. So I'm glad that this is coming out, and maybe we'll get to that in the discussion. Eric, private sector focus here. You're with the Center for International Private Enterprise, Global Alliance on Trade Facilitation. You advise companies as well. And you're beginning to be quite familiar with Sri Lanka now with this project. So give us a view from your end.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back here. I live in Washington, D.C., which has been going through some interesting changes in recent months. And so I think, first of all, when you look at the global landscape, there's been a lot of discussion about protectionism in the U.S. and protectionism in other jurisdictions. It's important to understand what's going on, and that is that countries are pursuing their national interests. So the U.S. is in the process of redoing the North American Free Trade Agreement. Much to everybody's relief, they're not going back and looking to impose tariffs and quotas. But there is a bigger agenda here which has to do with China. And certainly everybody in Sri Lanka and elsewhere are looking at how do you deal with the framework with China. And this goes to the very question of how do you deal with what are free trade agreements. Sometimes we think that they are magical accords which deliver benefits out of the sky, but in fact they are human creations that are based on deep understandings of interests and of goals. And so I think that for a country of this nature, it's important to push ahead with opportunities with China, but it's important to be very realistic about what is China looking to get out of this and how they're approaching it. And so when one thinks of the China Made in China 2025 plan, one sees an effort at pushing down the degree of foreign investment and looking at localization in the market. When one sees One Belt, One Road, one sees a great outlet for excess Chinese steel, which they can't sell through other channels in the world. And that's not to say that one shouldn't engage with them, but they're going to come very realistic, knowing full well what they are doing. The Chinese are right now pursuing a free trade agreement with Canada. They are sending large delegations in the middle of winter to Canada, which is not merely to view the sights and sounds of a fine winter day. They're figuring out who matters, what the country produces, what's important. And indeed, they will do that here. And so they will know you better than you know yourself. And so part of it is a process of figuring out how do you leverage the advantage of smallness. Because this is a country where everybody more or less knows everybody, at least by extension, you have an ability to leverage, if properly done, a decision-making process that others do not have, where you have vast interests spread across a large landscape. I mean, part of the challenge that even a country like India has had is a vastly diffuse federal system and a population of 1.2 billion people. And so this is about putting in place the domestic mechanisms to make this conversation happen. And so, first of all, what I've seen in other jurisdictions that have worked is a real commitment over a period of really a decade to build up the trade capacity. So you take the best minds of this generation of people and put them into working on trade policy. And that's not just in the government, that's also in the private sector. Because the private sector knows its business. But trade is a language unto itself. It is an ability, it is something that has to be translated into trade terms. And this means getting people to work with the Ceylon Chamber and work with others who will understand the nuances of how the apparel regime may work in a China trade agreement or in a Europe GSP framework, and figure out how that translates to the national interests on the ground. And so this is something which is fundamentally important in order to be successful, because you can't know how to succeed unless you know what your interests are. And knowing what your interests are is fundamentally a process of working through dialogue and figuring things out. I've always been one who said that every successful country in the world has taken their own path. When one looks at what happened in the late 1990s, where the IMF decided to come in and lecture Malaysia about their currency policy, and Malaysia turned out just fine. And that's because they understood what their interests were, but they were able to reflect that. They were able to reflect the overarching trends in the global economy. And so for a small country such as this, the key things are openness, which is intelligent trade opening that is properly negotiated, and frankly also efficiency. And this is where things like the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement come in. I'm here developing a project in that regard. And so you want to learn from Singapore. Part of it is to benchmark yourself against Singapore, look at the regime that will make you best in class in logistics, and every day get up and figure out, how am I going to shave seconds off of my times that are in the ports? How am I going to ensure that release times are faster in the ports? How am I going to ensure that I have proper cargo handling facility at the airport? All of this is what matters. And so it's about putting in place an agenda to say, yes, we are a smaller country in a smaller globalized world where efficiency and competitiveness are intense. We must find our own way. And the only way we will find our own way is to leverage our internal advantages and link those up to what one could call the exogenous factors of competitiveness in the world.
Thank you very much, Eric. Bringing the conversation, very importantly, close to home. And not to say that our previous panelists' comments weren't anchored to Sri Lanka's own reality, because a lot of things that they said, and I hope you were actively listening, a lot of things that they said, you can draw out very important pointers for Sri Lanka and very important priorities that Sri Lanka needs to consider. But now, explicitly focusing on Sri Lanka, I hand over to Dushni.
Thank you, Anushka. Let me first of all compliment Ganesh and Harsha for that very interesting two presentations. I think it's gave the foundation for what is turning out to be a stimulating discussion. Now, what both the speakers said and the panelists that followed, I think has very real implications for Sri Lanka. Today we are trying to actively pursue economic integration for the first time perhaps in over a decade, just at the time when there seems to be sort of a groundswell of opposition to the notions of free trade and globalization developing in some parts of the world. So the first question is, are we trying to do something impossible at this juncture? The answer to that, and that's my first point, is that Sri Lanka really has no option but to look at ways of integrating with the global economy. We are a resource-constrained, emerging economy of 20 million consumers. We simply don't have the market size to generate growth at a reasonable rate and sustain it over a period of time without relying on foreign demand for our goods and services. Related to that is also that we are at a particular stage of our development or growth process, whatever that we might wish to call it, when in recent years we relied on infrastructure-led, debt-financed growth. We have exhausted the potential for that growth process to continue. We have, on a sort of a larger macro framework, reached near saturation point in terms of the economy's ability to absorb debt. And we have now a couple of years in which we must reverse the decline in the GDP contribution, export contribution to GDP, and earn foreign exchange to comfortably settle our looming debt service payments from 2019 onwards. So first point is we have no choice. The second point I want to make is that even as we start pursuing closer economic integration, I think we must all recognize that we must not overhype the gains from trade and create impossible expectations. Because as what we have seen over the last 2-3 years, the backlash against globalization, that's not something that has sprung up overnight, but it has taken about a decade to spill over into national politics. Closer economic integration can have disruptive impacts on an economy. The movement of goods, services, investment, and labor, they move at different speed, and they can also create long-term structural unemployment. So there may be legitimate concerns that stakeholders have about when governments push ahead with integration. We must create the institutions, I think it was referred to by Elizabeth, where those concerns can be heard and policies implemented to mitigate them. If we don't do that, we run the risk that the forces of what you call populist nationalism, that is in the US, in some parts of Europe, those forces of populist nationalism can also spill over. I mean, today ideas move much more quickly across borders than any factor of production. And if entrenched interests feel that political elites are not listening to legitimate concerns, then the entire sort of efforts towards economic integration can really be counterproductive because you have to firefight along the way. My third point, and this is my final point, is on Sri Lanka's own trade policy. I think there are grounds for optimism. There was some sense of initial fumbling, but now we seem much more focused and pivoted to Asia. And I agree with Ganesh there that for Sri Lanka, Asia is where we are going to get the most benefits, whether it is in terms of diversifying our export base or in terms of getting more foreign investment or development finance to improve our physical connectivity with the rest of the world. Now, having focused on Asia, I think there is room for us to be more strategic in our trade policy itself. Over the last couple of years, we have tended to focus almost entirely on bilateral free trade agreements. The ongoing negotiations with India, China, Singapore. And I think I have no problems with those countries. These are very critical bilateral partners that we must negotiate with. But I think we are missing a roadmap in terms of what is our end objective in the economic integration process. Is it that we see ASEAN as a first step and RCEP, the free trade area of Asia and the Pacific that's been spoken of, and without that roadmap, there is also the danger, I think, that we can cast our FTA net quite wide and start bilateral negotiations with a large group of countries. Now, in all the overriding sort of policy thrust of greater economic integration is that we are looking to link our economy to global supply chains. Now, if we have multiple FTA negotiations, these are protracted, as was also mentioned, it will also mean that we have multiple tariff schedules with each of these FTA partners. Now, global supply networks work on the assumption that there is a seamless movement of inputs, raw material inputs, intermediates, and final goods across borders. So we can't have an FTA strategy alone that is going to, bilateral FTA strategy that is going to help us in linking to a global supply networks as well. So I think there is considerable space for us to align our bilateral FTA negotiations with unilateral reforms, and that is something I think that we have neglected. Liberalization of trade in goods, and that is essentially tariff reforms, I feel should be done at the unilateral level. If you do that with some understanding of simplifying our tariffs and coming to a relatively low tariff regime, you can plug those into your FTA negotiations. I think a point that Harsha also made, that there are some things that you can do in the bilateral FTA negotiation processes. The FTA negotiations, I feel, are much better focused on services and investment. The interests of individual countries are much more diverse, and bilateral negotiations will help us in getting really to grips with that. An example also is the Indo-Lanka FTA. If you look at the benefits that Sri Lanka got out of that agreement, the benefits were largely in services and investment, even though the agreement was on goods. And final note on the whole issue of FTAs and unilateral reforms. FTAs are magnets for rallying opposition to free trade in the current climate. If you look at the US, NAFTA was singled out, TPP gets singled out, and Sri Lanka really is no exception. We have had problems with SEPA, we have problems with ECTA, and therefore in the current sort of turbulent environment, I think it is much more strategic to have a mix of bilateral FTA reforms and unilateral reforms that will allow us to pace and sequence our trade strategy in the way that we can get the best tangible benefits out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dushni. I think once again, this message on not only focusing outward, but also looking at what's happening at home, on the unilateral reform, trade liberalization side, on the domestic reform agenda. And I think you made a very valid point about being strategic in terms of where, how wide or not we cast our FTA net. I'm going to now, I have a few questions to pose to the panelists, but I'm going to hold that back because I think I can integrate it with some of the very good questions coming from the audience. So let me try and cluster these in a sensible way. The first one we'll look at is a question from Shehara. How can Sri Lanka benefit from FTAs with low-cost manufacturers who have huge domestic markets, which have helped them grow volumes and reduce costs, when low-cost products will flood our markets and put manufacturers uncompetitive, make manufacturers uncompetitive? So I think here this question is about presumably Sri Lanka's FTAs with large markets where firms there have reached scale and competitiveness, oftentimes also with protection, and now they're going global, and those firms will be sending products to countries like Sri Lanka. So how can Sri Lanka benefit, or what must Sri Lanka look out for? I'm going to twin that in with another question. It is believed that FTAs between two countries are now fading away as it exploits one country and is beneficial to the larger country in the bilateral FTA. With this, how do you see the benefit from the Indo-Sri Lanka, benefit to Sri Lanka from the Indo-Sri Lanka FTA upcoming? That's directed specifically to Dr. Vignaraja, to Ganeshan. So I'm going to ask Ganeshan to answer the question directed to him, but also reflect on the other one with regard to doing an FTA with a big country where firms, exporters have reached scale. And if anyone else wants to jump in after that, we can do that too. So, Ganeshan.
Thank you. So on the Indo-Lanka FTA, I thought it should have taken place in 1987, 10 years after we opened our economy, because if India were closed and Sri Lanka were open, we get immediate access to foreign investment coming here and round-tripping through to India. So that would be the original benefit. Now we are in 2017, that FTA has not deepened, the goods FTA. So how do we benefit now? We benefit in at least 3 ways. The first way is that India is, interestingly, the magnet for outward investment from China, one of the magnets. Okay? So most of China's outward investment in the last 3 years has been going to Vietnam, to Indonesia, and to India. It is possible that through the FTA, some subcontracting may come from India to Sri Lanka if our manufacturing sector is of the particular type, and we can re-export through to India and then through to China. So that supply chain aspect is one really important aspect. Okay? A second thing that that FTA could bring is the services story. So the IT cluster in Bombay, in the south of India, particularly in Chennai and in other states, when the BPO industry decided to look for an alternative location because costs were rising in India, they didn't come here, they went to the Philippines. Again, because there was a lack of skilled labor, but there were no particular preferences or other issues there. So services would be another way in which we could benefit. Now, of course, as Dushni rightly said, we have to look at trade adjustment. I think that's a very serious issue, particularly when you have a small country and a large country. And this leads to me to the first question, which I was asked to answer, is that I think either you believe in the concept of comparative advantage, where every country has something they can produce to some benefit, or you don't. That's number one. If you don't, I don't really have a huge argument with you, because you come from a completely different paradigm to what I might believe in. And if you do, you have to then also believe in trade adjustment. And we have to have safety nets to ensure that sectors that get dislocated can be supported so that workers can retrain and restructure. We have to keep the education and health benefits going so that populations don't suffer. And we have to finance our small and medium enterprise. And we have to fix education and training in a way that we can create the new skill sets, particularly for the youth, to move into those new sectors. So trade adjustment is a huge part of what we do. What I have heard this morning was that there is a trade adjustment bill through Parliament that's happening or something of that type. What I don't know is the details, but we need to pay a huge amount of attention to that. Thank you.
We don't know the details either. And it's something we've been pushing for. In fact, over a year ago, we were asked to come up with some recommendations on what a trade adjustment package would look like. But we haven't seen much progress on that, because there is the risk, Ganeshan, that if not defined correctly, trade adjustment could mean everything from protecting individual companies or industries that are able to lobby effectively while leaving behind possible SMEs that don't have that access at one end of the spectrum, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is a more laissez-faire approach or more horizontal approach, which benefits all businesses, support structures, ease of doing business, and so on. So I think it's important to calibrate that effectively, and hopefully that's something that will happen soon. I think I'm going to go to Harsha for a quick response, and I'll ask all of you to keep your responses brief so that we can take a few more.
It's on? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. In addition to what Ganeshan said, trade adjustment, of course, means that there will be a massive relocation. So that's the focus of the question, that what will trade adjustment lead to? But I want to take a step back, because the whole presumption is that when you are negotiating a trade agreement, you're just opening up your whole market. That's not the case. There are sensitive products which are in the negative list. There are those where you take more time. There are those where you feel more comfortable opening up. And of course, it's a give and take for both economies. And what is really changing the situation in the world today actually is the first point which Ganeshan talked about, which is investment. Because when TPP was finalized, the happiest country amongst the 12 was Vietnam. Because Vietnam felt that it would start getting huge amount of investment in order to exploit the US market. So the fact that you are linked now to a big economy doesn't necessarily mean that your production will remain at the same level of efficiency. So that's one. Second, you can actually craft the agreement in such a way that you take care of your sensitivities. Third, I talked about creative flexibilities. You can actually link efforts inside the economy to efficiency gains and opening up. And third, there are aspects of safeguards, which once a particular threshold is crossed, you are entitled to put in place. But safeguards also have a limited period. Say, in the WTO, it's 8 years or 10 years. Once you take all this into account, that's enough time period, not just for trade adjustment, but for expanding, if you do smart policies, not just trade policies, but other supplementary policies, to change the system of efficiency itself.
Eric, I think you want to jump in, and I'll also ask you to add in a comment on how can the private sector, associations or individual companies, be more effective at getting their voice heard in advocating for some of these? Because it's very important to have that voice heard, and sometimes we are not always effective. What are some of the clever strategies?
Yeah. So first of all, on the other point, to go even further, it's key to underscore even things like the rules of origin, where you can bake in certain industrial policy outcomes, such as what the US did on the use of American textiles and apparel production. And so you can get very specific about what outcomes you are looking at. In terms of what the private sector needs to do, a lot of it is recognizing that going into the reform process is going to be different. And trade is a language, and it's a system of doing things. It's understanding everything from classification under the harmonized system to how valuation works to you name it. And so it's a matter of taking the knowledge that business people have across the economy and translating that into interests. Now, certainly there are winners and losers in the process, but there are ways that you can mitigate against those who may lose more, and ways to encourage those who can gain more. And a lot of it has to do with identifying what you want to do, why you want to do it, and where you want to go. And that means a very extensive, indeed labor-intensive process with the private sector, but understanding how to translate where it is you're going and where market developments are going into the language of trade, and then inserting those in clever ways into the agreement. And so that's why I go back to what I said in my comments, that this is a 10-year process to train the next generation of Sri Lankan economists, lawyers, and other thinkers in the language of trade, so that they are effectively able to advise both the business community, but also the government in this process. And once you get these folks trained, there'll be a lot of back and forth movement between the government and the private sector. And indeed, one thing I would be doing is setting up a kitchen cabinet of your leading private sector firms and others to effectively shape knowledge that can be put forth to the government in articulating your negotiating interests. Because this is not something that you can just do when the government comes to ask you. You need to put in place a process so that you are in their face articulating your interests in a way that is useful to them on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. Elizabeth, a couple of questions to you. The first is, Australia did a structural adjustment with the motor vehicle manufacturing being wound up and redeploying labor to other areas of the economy. Anything you could share on this? So I'll ask you to answer that specifically and very briefly, but also to zoom out and talk a little bit about this overall structural adjustment, because Australia went from one of the most protectionist economies to being one of the most liberal, and that certainly wouldn't have been an easy adjustment to make. How did you get everyone on board and think about adjustment in this way? Get consensus.
Thanks. That's if you've got the next 3 hours, maybe we could take that one on. That is actually a very detailed and significant topic, and and one worth teasing out. In the 2-minute version, I guess what I can say is that over a period during the 1980s, the Australian government changed its policy settings economically in the broad from being a rather closed economy to being a very open economy. And it did so very carefully, not without teething problems, obviously, but it attempted to deliver these reforms in a compact with the trade union movement in Australia, with the business community, and then more broadly with the Australian community. So very, very alive to the fact that we were removing tariff walls which had protected a number of our industries, and which many years later has also led to vehicle manufacturers now leaving Australia, has from time to time meant that Australia has gone through real periods of needing to re-skill our workforce, and there have been some very focused programs put in place to try and manage very specific needs in the community. But also more broadly, I think, at least in the 1980s when we were putting broad-based reforms in place, we were a rather now old-fashioned economy if you look back. So we had wage indexation. So at that time there was this effort to index the real wage. This is not really necessarily something that you would advocate in a more modern economy, but it was certainly, we thought through ways to try and manage some of those teething problems. Anushka.
I'm going to take a few more questions that the audience has put forward, and I'm going to put this one to Dushni. Can we have an example of an industry in Sri Lanka that has actually benefited from a trade deal other than GSP plus, please? And while there's also another one that I might put to you. I feel like it has already been covered, but and it's a little obvious. Sri Lanka's domestic barriers to trade constitute the biggest obstacle to trade, and I think that's a very valid observation. Any comment on this, if anyone wants to add in there? So until you gather your thoughts on that, I'm going to read out a couple of other remarks that are both questions and comments that I think we've covered, or that I think everyone will agree with, so there's little point in putting it to the panel. Ease of doing business, we are 110, and quality of infrastructure, we are at 64. Our benchmark is Singapore, is ranked 2 on both parameters. Who will or who needs to drive this change? We simply can't blame it on bureaucracy and buy time. And I think that's something that came out in the earlier session as well, and hopefully in the last panel tomorrow, you'll get a chance to hear some of the politicians talking about that. Another one, how will FTAs impact the local agricultural sector, specifically the farmers and local communities that depend on agriculture, considering we won't be able to compete with India, for example, in terms of price for rice and other products? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that most of FTAs would have agricultural products in the negative list. So, well, I think that's the position Sri Lanka has taken for most of our FTAs as a sensitive product. Another one which I might pose to Elizabeth or anyone else who wants to jump in, and I think again it's one of those questions that have a very obvious response because all of us would agree. For such important and long-drawn negotiations, shouldn't the government allocate more resources with skill and experience beyond a single person and Department of Commerce? I think we'll all agree, yes. to that, but is there anyone who wants to take this? Maybe even Elizabeth, in terms of resourcing this, FTAs aren't child's play.
Just a brief comment about resourcing an FTA. While it is obviously for a smallish group of individuals to actually be sitting at the table transacting that business with the other government, an FTA is actually a lot more than that, and it takes an entire community to do an FTA. I always say to my teams, we do 20% of the work of the FTA at that table. 80% of that work is at home. And it is for the business community to be helping the government to support the government's narrative. And without the business community support in supporting the narrative of the government and helping to deliver some messages about the benefits of that FTA, I would say it is very difficult for you to be moving forward and doing those FTAs successfully.
Dushni, coming back on the specific question that I posed to you.
Right. FTA benefits. I mean, when you look at benefits, you have to look at FTAs that benefit consumers, workers, exporters. So it's not just domestic industry that benefits, it cuts across all this. So I don't think I need to elaborate on consumer benefits, a better choice of, wider choice of goods perhaps at a lower price. But on the industry, let's take India-Sri Lanka FTA. There are examples of specific industries that have benefited. Even if you take it at a very broad level, looking at the number of products that we exported in 2000 and the number of products that we export by 2015, you'll see that the export base has expanded. But some products I can mention, rubber. Joint ventures that led to certain rubber manufacturers coming together with Indian joint ventures and exporting back to India. So exporters in rubber, in furniture, that not only export from here, but to the extent that they have also established production units in India. So there are, at the overall level, various streams, and we try to capture this through looking at what we might call net welfare benefits. And in the process of those FTA benefits, when you say net, it means you're netting out the winners and the losers. So inevitably, a trade agreement does have losers in it. It is to determine whether the overall, when you net it all out, that an economy gains or not.
I'm sure you want to jump in.
Yeah, Elizabeth talked about the whole community being involved, not just commerce. Actually, what we have to take a step back is that FTA is not just goods, and FTA is not just tariff policy. FTA is services, FTA is regulation. And the moment you go to services, you have so many different ministries involved. You cannot conduct an FTA without coordination with these ministries. So experts from the ministries have to participate. So it's not just a commerce initiative. Just one example. Then the issue about agriculture, rice example was given. I talked about flexibilities, addressing sensitive products, and I don't think all of agriculture will be in the negative list. And if you, having an FTA with Australia, they'll want none of it in the agriculture list. So, but take rice. Rice was a sensitive issue for Japan in TPP. Far more sensitive, I think, than it would be for Sri Lanka because they define their whole culture based on rice, etc. And US was extremely keen to sell rice to Japan. And they reached a deal. They reached a deal because they combined a market opening together with just limiting the access through tariff rate quota and implementing that opening over 30 years. So that was the point I was making. And FTA is not just that you don't look after your sensitivities. It's both what you want from others and focus on it, plus what you want to actually give yourself more breathing space to decide. Then suppose you take, there was a comment on domestic trade barriers, etc. Actually, the important point which I was trying to make is that we still think about domestic trade barriers as affecting only trade. They affect your economic performance. Trade policy is not just the conventional trade policy we thought about, on which I grew up. Tariffs, quotas, etc., import licenses. No. Today, you take a look at the subject matters in TPP or RCEP. They go way beyond that into the domestic economy. Domestic trade barriers affect your economic efficiency itself. Therefore, you have to deal with them. You may decide to deal with the domestic ones first before the border ones. Second, if you want to promote your trade opportunities, the point I was making is don't just focus domestically. Focus on how, once you have competitiveness, you are competing with others outside in the market. What are the efforts you have to do with those you want to connect to? They are not just trade policy. That's the key point I was trying to emphasize.
Thank you, Harsha. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to end this. Ganesh, I'll come to you and I'll give you the last word, and we go in this order. I'd like each of you to give us one thing. Remember the title of this session, Executing a Smarter Trade Strategy Amidst Turbulence. So to ask you to, in 30 seconds or less, one thing that you think should be an imperative for Sri Lanka in executing a smarter trade strategy. Eric, Elizabeth, I'm going to skip Harsha, Tushni, and Ganesha.
Why will you skip me?
Because you spoke earlier. Okay, I'll give you a chance. Okay. So you get 15 seconds.
Yeah. Set up a tiger team of the best and brightest across the government, put them together with the private sector, figure out your sensitivities, and go forth and negotiate with your eyes wide open.
Work out what Sri Lanka stands for, where it wants to position itself in the global economy, work out the right policy settings to fit with that vision, and go with it.
I think till now we have focused on trade policies, even though larger in conventional sense. The way GVCs are developing is through lead firms and private standards. That's something nobody is focusing on. Without that, you can open your trade, you can have as many FTAs as you want, you won't have access to the world economy.
I think for me, domestic regulatory reforms that are aligned to certain unilateral reforms that we do at the border level for trade, but domestic reforms that are broad-based, I think we need to address that first, and that will allow us to reap the full benefits of any FTAs.
Ganesh, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think we should build our FTA negotiation capacity properly through a dedicated USTR type body, and that should come under the Prime Minister or the President's office, and it should crisscross the two trade ministries we have, the multiple agencies, etc. It should have a dedicated team of lawyers and economists, particularly if you're trying to do multiple negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gents. I think you don't need me to summarize this. It's a vast topic, but our speakers managed to bring it down, not just from conceptual issues, but specific next steps and priorities for Sri Lanka, and some very important lessons, particularly starting with the presentations by Ganeshan and Harsha, and the others who really pitched in with specifics. Some of the big takeaways for me are being strategic with our trade policy, not casting it too wide, understanding, and links to what Elizabeth said, understanding what does Sri Lanka want, and going for those deals strategically without casting it too wide. A very clear message coming out across the panel about the need to focus on domestic reforms, unilateral reforms, regulatory or trade facilitation barriers that are holding existing Sri Lankan businesses back and are also preventing or also giving a poor signal to prospective investors and businessmen in Sri Lanka. It matters to both, and I think that's very important in terms of creating a good playing field. And finally, on this issue of both the trade negotiating capacity, having a crack team of individuals, but also building that ecosystem where there is good dynamic interaction between the private sector and government in order to get those inputs. This is something the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce focuses a lot on, especially our unit at the Economic Intelligence Unit, where we often throw out many, many channels for our members, for the private sector to engage with government, whether it's written submissions, whether it's platforms for one-to-one discussion. But I feel that there's a lot more that needs to happen. We don't get enough inputs, and without those inputs, we can't make a strong voice to government, and government in turn, the trade negotiating team in turn, can't go and put forward our defensive and offensive interests. So ultimately, it is the content provided by you, and not just on goods, but on services, investment, trade facilitation, that can really shape these FTAs. It's not a them and us. These, whether it's FTAs or other trade policy measures, matter to all of us, whether we are producers, consumers, investors, or just interested and concerned citizens. So thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to those who sent in questions. Finally, on a personal note, I really want to dedicate this session to one of Sri Lanka's champions on trade policy, who passed away recently, Dr. Saman Kalegama, who was a boss, mentor, and friend to me, and who worked with Dushni and others as well. We lost a huge resource, but I think it's now on all of us to take on that good fight forward and really be strategic, and that's something he fought for, one of the foremost trade economists in this region. So with that small note, I'd like to end, and I call upon our CEO to hand over some tokens of appreciation. Thank you very much, everyone.